All right, finishing out chapter 26 with this part and completing the move to the frontier. And then what do we do with farmers? Or rather, what do farmers want to happen in America in the late 1800s? So there's a massive western migration because of mining in the 1850s. Of course, we've already talked about how California was settled and pushed for statehood in 1850, causing the Compromise of 1850. But many other states were also created because of the mining boom out west, including Colorado, Nevada. Uh, Nevada especially has a place called Virginia City, which becomes a perfect example of a phenomenon known as a boom town. First, they find the minerals there. People move there in large numbers. Virginia City, in just a few months, turned out to have 30,000 people. However, once they run out of that ore, it quickly becomes a ghost town. So several years later, I think 15 years later, Virginia City is down to only 1,500 people living in that same location. So that's boom town to ghost town. But regardless, most of those people stayed out west just looking for the next mining opportunity. We often think that maybe random the individual could go out there and make a lot of money, but corporations, as with most things, take over most of the mining. So it's big businesses, like everything else in the Gilded Age, that ends up making most of the money. Women, however, a key thing to note, did gain semi-equality in the West. Wyoming is the first state to grant women the right to vote, and a lot of that has to do with how they were basically equal workers and sharers of society out west, as opposed to the more traditional established East Coast. So mining brings wealth and the population, and also some rights to women out west. Then we have the beef bonanzas and the long drive. So railroads further north, as you can see on this map, railroads in Nebraska and Kansas became the site for what we call the long drive. Cattle grown in Texas would be driven hundreds of miles so that those cowboys could make 10 times the profit selling the cattle to those railroads. So Kansas City and Chicago became the centers of the meatpacking industry because cowboys constantly drove them from Texas to those northern cities to sell for that profit. So what ends up bringing the end to the era of the cowboy? The cowboys only last for about 22 years. So what brings an end to them is the settlement out west. The fact that barbed wire was built on the open range, which was the area that the government opened for settlement beyond basically the western border of, say, Arkansas. Barbed wire is built on those settlements in the open range. And then you also have the blizzards, which kills their economic investments. But so farmers, so barbed wire would surround these homesteads. So for a long time, when those cattle were being driven up north, people who moved out west weren't able to create fences. So barbed wire is what ends the long drive. But how did all those people get out west to build those farms? It was from the 1862 Homestead Act. For a long time, the Republican Party had been pushing for this westward expansion to make land cheap and available to people on the East Coast so that they could move further west and settle that area and also have an economic opportunity outside of working in a factory for other people. So these farmers, what's amazing with the Homestead Act is that they sold plots of 160 acres for only $10 per homestead. So 500,000 Americans moved out west to take advantage of the greatest land sale in world history. These farmers, however, did not have an easy life. They had a lack of wood and water. In fact, the first explorer of the Great Plains called it the Great American Desert because there was no wood or water out west. They also faced constant droughts, heat in the summer, blizzards in the winter. Of course, you know they also have tornadoes out in those western states. And then because there was no wood, they had to live in basically mud huts, sod houses built out of grass and dried dirt. Thousands of farmers end up turning back because of just how tough it was, but others adjust as time passes. Others that stay out there long enough are able to succeed because of a new type of wheat that was able to survive such harsh conditions. So the Great Plains slowly become the breadbasket due to the federal funds, dams which helped them get water, and that special wheat strain. The West became officially settled in this time period. So we finally have the western portion of our nation completely settled, and the Homestead Act combined with railroads are a big part of why that was able to be settled. couple maps you can look and decipher for yourself if you would like to later. So, the fading frontier. In 1890, the census declared that there was no longer an actual discernible frontier line. We could always previously draw exactly where the frontier ended. So, one historian named Frederick Jackson Turner writes the significance of the frontier in American history. And he points out the fact that we no longer had somewhere for Americans to escape to. It had always been the safety valve of discontent. If you were upset with your lot in life or frustrated, you moved out west and got a brand new start. So now, where exactly would Americans go for this brand new start or new opportunities? Settlers had made profit not on farming but selling their land as others moved west. So, what are we going to do with the frontier gone? Where are we going to go? So, this economic and psychological issue became a key issue for the nation. One major point that you must understand, however, is it is in 1890, around this time, that America has now settled all of our continent. And because of that, we now begin looking outside. So previously, all of our interactions with other countries tended to do with control of land on North America or land that we could easily own if we were able to defeat those peoples. So this is what begins the age of expansion, or as we'll call in the next few chapters, the age of American imperialism. We spread our wings and go beyond our borders to expand. So there are other things that happen with farming during this time period. Great Plains farmers have mechanization, which allows them to create massive farms where they can grow single crash crops like wheat and corn. Just as the industrial machinery advanced, so did farming. So you can see several different creations there. The only problem with this is if you're going to buy that machinery, you also have to go into debt. So if crop prices stayed high, you'd be fine. But when everyone settles out west, the price of wheat drops because the amount of wheat being produced was too much to keep prices profitable. So the more farmers made, the more the debt increased and prices dropped. So they were also especially hurt by banks who decided to give them loans up to 40% interest, which would be absolutely brutal. And when farmers had issues paying those loans, there was no pity given to them. So farmers did not just face problems from the economics of their lives, having to purchase that machinery and go into massive debt. They also have droughts, they have locusts, cotton boll weevils, floods, droughts, and erosion. So as you can see here, they're not exactly having an easy life. Government also charges high property taxes, did not help them out with railroads or other businesses to help them get around those fees. And unlike workers, they did not have a man like Samuel Gompers to organize them in an American Federation of Labor to help them fight for their rights. However, farmers do finally begin getting together, first in a group known as the Grange. This first farmers organization began as kind of a hangout. They would have ice cream socials, and as they got together, they realized that they had the same issues. And because of that, they began forming more of an organization. So it is this group in the upper Mississippi Valley and out west that begins passing laws called Granger laws to regulate the railroads. You'll remember, however, that those laws were undone by the Wabash Supreme Court case. After that, you then have the Farmers Alliance, which is an even larger organization of farmers politically organizing. They fight against the rails and manufacturers that are charging high rates and unfairly hurting them. Unfortunately for the Farmers Alliance, they fall apart due to racial divisions. Remember, many farmers were African American, and so because they could not agree on the future of African Americans, especially in the South, the Farmers Alliance falls apart. But eventually, the greatest alliance of farmers in the 1890s rises out of what we call the Populist Party. Millions of farmers leave their traditional parties and they organize as one big farming voting bloc. Key figures among them, I've already mentioned James B. Weaver. That's right, people believed in him. Unfortunately, he didn't really win the presidency, but he did organize a lot of farmers together. However, my favorite is probably Mary E. Lease, a female, which tells you that women farmers were becoming leaders out west. But Mary E. Lease tells her fellow farmers that maybe they need to stop raising less corn and raising more hell. And that is exactly what they did. But briefly, before we get into the main election push for them, populists who are farmers said, what if we combine with industrial workers? If we could get farmers and workers together on the same ticket, then we could probably bring massive change to Washington. One of those workers who decided that he would push for those changes is Jacob Coxey. He marched all the way, I believe, from Ohio to Washington, organizing many different people with him. And they wanted to push the government to handle to inflate currency so debts were easy to pay off, and for those who were struggling in the early 1890s because of that panic of 1893, maybe the government could create public works programs which would pay them to build schools or bridges or something, at least giving these people a job through government funding. We also have talked previously in class about the Pullman strike. workers who were frustrated with how Pullman was treating them in the lack of wages, constant wage slashes, and in that panic of 1893, it became too much for them. However, like other strikes in the late 1890s, they were shut down by the federal government, who used the troops to put it down. One leader that we'll mention in later chapters, one of the main socialist leaders of the early 1900s, was there for that strike, and he continues to fight. So workers continue fighting, however, they are unsuccessful, which brings us to the election of 1896. With this presidential election looming, one major issue became the focus. With farmers in so much debt and workers also struggling, they wanted to push for the inflation of our currency, and that is by backing our currency with both gold, as it had been for years and years and years, but also monetizing silver so our currency would be backed by gold and silver. You'll often see this referenced as bimetallism in the kind of the paperwork in that day and the writings. So Republicans nominated William McKinley, who had actually he had pushed hit the McKinley tariff, if you remember, is the highest peacetime tariff in our history. So he was funded by millionaires, especially Mark Alonzo Hanna, a person who loved laissez-faire and limited government. So you can see there's no way that Republicans would support any of these farmers or workers' ideas. Democrats, however, were divided. They didn't have faith in Cleveland because of that Great Depression, or that massive depression of 1893. He'd made the deal with Morgan, then he didn't do anything about the Pullman strike, and he did not help them out with their currency. So it is at their convention, without them able to choose someone to run, that William Jennings Bryan gives a famous speech, which I will send out to you on Microsoft Teams. Or if this is some other year, I'll send it out to you in some method. But William Jennings Bryan wins the nomination because of his passionate historic Cross of Gold speech. And in it, the main focus he says is, if farmers want this change to bimetallism, to inflate our currency, then we should give it to them because it is on them that our nation relies. And he says that if you're going to leave currency basically only backed by gold, you are crucifying them on a cross of gold. This is such a powerful speech at the Democratic convention that populists actually throw their support behind William Jennings Bryan. Now, the issue is that Republicans wisely said, well, we can turn this against them. And what they did is they campaigned focusing on the tariff issue. But they also said that if William Jennings Bryan became president, what would occur is that foreign businesses would not trust our currency. They would cut contracts with factories. And many factory workers in urban areas received notices that should William Jennings Bryan win the presidency, you might as well not come into work tomorrow. But if McKinley wins, then you will have a job for a long time. So you can understand how they divided the workers from the farmers, and Republicans are able to win the election of 1896. Now, the issue of the gold versus the bimetal standard does not go away, and the populist movement may not have been successful. What we'll see over the next 20 years, this is coming toward the end of the Gilded Age when we'll enter the Progressive Era. All these ideas we've been seeing, regulating railroads, changing currency, regulating banks, reining in these powerful businesses that run everything. We're going to see some massive changes here in a few chapters when that Progressive Era starts, beginning with McKinley's death and Vice President Teddy Roosevelt's promotion to president. But until then, poor farmers are forced to suffer for several more years, along with many workers. So this wraps up chapter 26. The farmers and the workers failing to really get what they needed as far as change, and they'll have to wait for the Progressive Era. We've also seen the entire frontier explored and settled, so we're being pushed towards imperialism to expand outside of our borders. And then we've also seen Native Americans rounded up and treated cruelly with their culture and land taken away from them by the Dawes Act. So those are all the main ideas of this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Have a great day.